It's fascinating to ask the question if we're in a post-truth era. Broader societies, in particular democratic societies, are now having to respond to misinformation and lies in the way that the human rights movement has always had to respond to misinformation and lies. This has always been our world. Now it's everyone's world.
What it comes down to is that we study violence. Violence that's been, in most cases, inflicted by the state on its citizens.
We understand our job as collecting information, organizing that information, and presenting it in ways that help people advance arguments to advance human rights.
A lot of times, human rights abuses, the evidence is hidden in data that's generated by abusive regimes, and so we hope to work with those sources of data in order to uncover evidence of abuses.
How do we go from a story, a single killing, an act of torture, a disappearance, from narrative to database records? It's very important to get the data into a database. But what about the records you don't have? What about the silences? The data will emphasize the suffering of the visible people and hide the suffering of those who are already marginalized, excluded, and silenced.
There's an entire school of methods that has been developed and that is growing very rapidly for processing what we call unstructured text, so just written words, prose, trapped inside a PDF.
It's exactly in these documents that are not in analyzable form that the evidence does exist, and it has been kind of removed by the time we get to the analyzable data.
And for an individual to manually go through and pull all of the critical information out of that is incredibly time-consuming and in many cases can be prohibitive for a project. But there are now all of these machine learning approaches that can make that process more efficient and scalable.
And it turns out that machine learning algorithms can reproduce almost exactly the same answers people produce with their intuitive, judgment-based decisions. So now I can use this machine learning model to characterize millions and millions and millions of records.
By recovering that evidence, that's kind of the first step towards not only kind of making claims of systemic bias and systemic violence, but proving that they're happening by pointing to the evidence.
We think it's important to use the most advanced scientific techniques that the world has to offer to understand who has been excluded, who has been marginalized, and to tell their stories, at least with the numbers.
Everyone on our team is motivated by the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. We're all just trying to find the skill that we can contribute to that effort.
The Universal Declaration is a kind of contract between citizens and governments that governments grant these rights and citizens don't rebel. It only works if citizens demand these rights, and if citizens hold these rights as more important than whatever parochial appeal that populist leaders use to justify campaigns of state violence. Human rights instruments and human rights mechanisms have gotten much weaker in the last approximately 10 years as a consequence of these appeals to essentially populism and nationalism. I'm deeply, deeply worried about the future of human rights as a tool to hold governments accountable.